kontextualisera lite.
Ja,
Kendell. Precis.
Hallå. Jag ska bara berätta lite kort för att lite ta upp tid för Kendell här. Jag kom in lite sent i det här projektet för att jag är inte egentligen projektledare, utan det är 12 kulturutvecklare i 12 kranskommuner till Göteborg som tog initiativ. De hade möjlighet att söka pengar, de hade aldrig jobbat tillsammans tidigare på det sättet, så hade de möjlighet att söka pengar, och de upplevde också att de hade blivit mer bekymrade i sitt jobb. De hade blivit mer oroliga. Vilka slags konstprojekt, vilka slags kulturprojekt kan vi göra som inte... Någonstans känner man att ibland närmar man sig ämnen som är liksom minerad mark, och de kände att ibland kanske är så att de till och med avstår för att lyfta sådana frågor utav ren rädsla. Någonting hade hänt, upplevde de i sitt jobb. Och då förstod jag också, det går ju att läsa, det stod i Dagens Nyheter, tror jag var i förrgår, att hot mot journalister, konstnärer, kulturarbetare ökar runt om i världen. Så det blev utgångspunkten för att de sökte pengar för ett konstprojekt som skulle lyfta det här ämnet. Så de kallar för smittande oro, smittande mod. Och de fick pengar, inte så mycket pengar, men ganska okej pengar. Och när de fått pengar så visste de inte riktigt hur drar vi igång här, och de visste inte riktigt. Och så var någon tips om mig som hade jobbat med större konstprojekt tidigare. Så att jag kom in ganska sent och insåg när jag hade läst deras ansökan att det var saker som inte skulle gå att genomföra rent praktiskt, för att både ekonomiskt och praktiskt så skulle det inte funka. Så att vad som blev resultatet var att 4 konstnärer, varav en är då lokal konstnär, Nina Bondesson, sen är det Kendell Geers, det är efter Geertz och det är Mikael von Hauswolf. De har producerat varsin bild, ett foto som sen visas då i de här 12 kranskommunerna. Och i måndags då så var det vernissage på Kendells bild, och då visas den då på olika platser i alla 12 kommunerna samtidigt. Och första konstnären ut var efter Geertz. Och valet jag har gjort med konstnärer, det är konstnärer som jag vet kan jobba med det här ämnet, som antingen att de själva har varit utsatta eller att de i sitt konstnärskap på ett annat sätt lyfter de här frågorna. Och vi har en hemsida, kan vi in och titta och bara söka på smittande oro, smittande mod, så kan ni läsa mer om det projektet. Så nu vet ni lite grann vad det handlar om. Och Kendell är då en av konstnärerna som är med, som jag har bjudit in. Han hade då en föreläsning i Öckerö i samband med invigningen av hans bild, och så igår i Kungsbacka. Det var ett större seminarium kring de här sakerna. Okej, kan du? Thank you, stage. It's yours.
Thank you very much. You all understand English? Yeah, that's good. Okay. I do apologize that I can't speak in your language, so we'll have to speak in English.
Have you put on the microphone?
Pardon?
Did you put on?
Did I put on? No, I guess not. Where do I put it on?
There, somewhere.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
All right. So now you can hear me.
Great.
And now I can hear myself in case I didn't before, which is always good. The context of me being here in Gothenburg is for the project where I was invited to present an image which would be simultaneously presented in the 12 communities. It's 12 if I'm right? It's 12? Which is a very exciting project, and I'm very happy to be part of it because it's a subject very close to my heart and very close to my art, the idea of freedom. Now, I'll talk a little bit about freedom and about this image, and then I will go into my journey as an artist in order to try to explain how I might arrive at this image. It's a deliberately ambiguous image. because for me freedom is an extremely ambiguous concept. Whenever people speak about freedom, I will ask them very directly, how do you know that you're free? What is your measure of freedom? We all think we're free. We all think we're intelligent. We all think we're secretly, we all think we're good looking. You know, the subjectivity from the inside is very difficult and complicated and the concept of freedom presupposes two things. Is it freedom from persecution? Freedom from tyranny? Freedom from hostility? Or is it freedom to? The second form of freedom takes more courage. Freedom to become something. Freedom to be something. Freedom to say something. It's very different than freedom from. And in a way, freedom from is easy because you're running away. And it's actually quite easy to run away. Freedom to takes more courage. Now the image is deliberately obscure and ambiguous. And I discovered the ambiguity 2 nights ago when there was a chat room where people from the 12 communities were invited to respond to me online. And one of the questions was, why did I select an image of a young boy? Now, I would not have thought that myself, but there was obviously an androgyny and an ambiguity in the image. I mean, the androgyny was very conscious, because I wanted to work with something that was in between. But to my mind, it's very much a woman. But there was a reading of it as being male, which I took as a great compliment. So this woman is holding the hand up, and the hand says play. Now, play is a very ambiguous word. Things play out in many different ways. We play out rituals, we play out games. Words have double meanings, so that's a play on words. Then you have the 2 forms of prayer. So prayer as in sacred submission, where you would use your hands. We'll get to that in a minute. And the other pray is where things are being devoured, or you're being preyed upon. And of course there's pay. As I was trying to think about the image, what image I might use in order to enter into this dialogue of the play of these 4 words, I was thinking, for instance, about, I come from South Africa, but I currently live in Belgium, and this very iconic image of Magritte. So a lot of my works are rooted in art history, rooted in language, rooted in discourse, rooted in things that we've inherited, and common understandings that I will speak about in a minute. And of course in this image, it's called The Lovers, and you have the man, presumably male and female, but it's not necessarily, we don't know what's happening beneath the veil, beneath the mask. But these two lovers that are in a process of an embrace, but they're separated. They're separated by the masked face, which might be some form of play, some kind of erotic game. Might even be an erotic game that's been paid for. Somebody might be in the process of being devoured in this process. And of course the covering of the head will, to the most people's imagination today, evoke the idea of Islam and the idea of the burqa. And we might assume that covering the head is something that we might want to protest against in terms of women's rights. Now, my image is very much, I see it as a feminist image. It's an empowered woman, it's a powerful woman. It's not a woman in submission, it's not a woman who is anybody's victim. But the veil is, and the idea of how we might construct our prejudices and our ideas of freedom is very much dependent on what side of the border you're on. Because that border determines whether you're going to be the prey or whether you're going to be the carnivore. And there's something great about human nature. Even in its most dire of circumstances, a father, presumably, will be taking care of his child, trying to introduce the idea of game in order to alleviate the pain and the suffering. It's not just Islam that was wearing the veil. It was not very long ago that Christians too were wearing the veil, where the veil was a form of paying your respects to a higher authority, a way of covering your head in order to submit to something greater than yourself, something you believe in. Now, what you believe in and your values, of course, is determined by who you are. So, this image of the cannibals preying upon other humans. Now, imagine if you're born in a cannibal tribe. Imagine if you're in the middle of the jungle somewhere and your value system is cannibalistic. The terrorist and the subversive person in that particular context will be the vegetarian, or even the non-cannibal. And what's normal in a cannibal tribe is very abnormal in the cultures that we most live in today, and vice versa. The question that I would like you to then wonder is, who's right? And of course, when we think about cannibalism, the next step would be the idea of trophy hunters, which, I come from South Africa, and poaching is very much a big problem today in South Africa. Poaching for rhino horn and for ivory, where animals are being culled every day in favor of an illegal, illicit trade in these trophies. But let me ask you, if you are praying to an ivory Madonna, or if you're trying to sing a beautiful song about ebony and ivory on an ivory keyboard, are you innocent of supporting poaching? I think not. If you are doing your anti-capitalist marches and you're holding your iPhone in your hand, does that mean that the blood of the children who died to make your iPhone is not on your hands? I think not. We are locked into a global matrix, a global web, a web of consumerism, a web of capitalism, a networked chain where things come to us in a service industry, where we don't have to do anything, and your phones arrive in your hand, and information arrives on your phones. But where's the price that you pay for that freedom? What is the price, what is the consequence of that freedom? Now, Trump might say global climate change global warming is the wrong word because sometimes it's getting very cold. Climate change. Trump would say that climate change is not taking place, but we all know that climate change is happening. And we all know that our time on the planet has a sell-by date. Our species is in danger. If we don't change the way that we live on the planet and start behaving more as guests rather than as the highest authority on the planet, our time is numbered. We need to submit to the idea that there are things greater than ourselves. Submit to the idea that there are things in the world that we might be networked in, that we need to walk with respect and pay homage to, and not try to take control over and dominate. So this is a work, it's my own hands, and this work has exactly the same title as the 4 words in the image I made: pay, pray, the other pray, and pay. Because in this image of me with my hands being handcuffed, of course it conjures the image of Dürer, which is part of our collective memory of art history, in order to understand how art history has been delivered to us, and how we might decode those archetypes, decode those images. But the submission might be a game, an erotic game where one is being handcuffed. It might be prayer to a deity that I might believe in. I might be somebody else's prey, somebody's victim. There's so many multiple readings of what might be going on in that simple process of hands being handcuffed. And it might not be what you think it is. Just like the person beneath the veil might not be who you think it is. I guess what I'm asking you today, and this is the work I made called Manifest. What do you believe in? And I wonder how many of us today could answer that question. What do you believe in? Belief is complicated, so this is the work I made, which is a normal police baton, absolutely functional, from the South African military. And it's called A Rose by Any Other Name, which is quoting the sonnet of Shakespeare, where he says that a rose by any other name is the same thing. However you name it, whatever you say, however you try and mask it, no matter how gold you try and paint it, it's still police batons beneath. But the configuration and the shape of it brings to mind the idea of the church and state, and how we submit ourselves to these higher authorities of morality, the church and the state, which create the society that we live within in order to be better citizens, in order to make things function peacefully and normally. What does normally mean? So I want to talk to you today about the banana experiment, and it's about these monkeys that it was a test done some years ago by, I guess, there must have been psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists. And the images that I'm showing you, they're not my images. These are images I took from the internet. It's a very famous experiment, and you can choose any number of images. I just chose these. So the monkeys experiment was basically an experimental situation in which these monkeys were put into a cage with some bananas. I guess they were very delicious bananas, because every time the monkeys went up to fetch a banana, they would be blasted with a fire hydrant, very cold and very harsh, very violent treatment. And each time the monkeys went up, it was the same result until eventually, at some point, the monkeys stopped fetching bananas. It became normal. It became their pattern to not fetch the bananas. It became their habit. And then what the scientists did is they took one monkey out and they put a new monkey in. And what happened is the new monkey went up to fetch the bananas, and then the other monkeys attacked the new monkey because the other monkeys had the memory of the fire hydrant. They took another monkey out and replaced it, and so on and so forth, until not one single one of the monkeys in the room had the physical memory left of the fire hydrant. So what had happened was it became normal, common sense and habit for the monkeys to associate the bananas with pain. But in the end, none of the monkeys could explain why they were associating the bananas with pain, because they didn't have that memory. They just took it as normal. Now, in so many ways, that might explain how we end up following church and state, father, police, every higher authority that family, institution, school that we're born into, where we take for granted certain belief systems. Now, we will all say cannibalism is wrong because we're not born into a cannibalism context. Now, if you had been born into the tribe of cannibals, you'd be told vegetarianism is wrong, probably. And your morality, your value system, everything that you hold to be true, right, good, is something you've inherited that somewhere in the chain of your ancestry, in the chain of your social, cultural, ancestral antecedents, there was the fire hydrant who was creating the context, which was setting up the Pavlovian situation that was associating certain things with good and other things with evil. On a very simple, basic level, it starts at home and in the school. As we learn our ABCs, as we learn how to read and write, as we trust our school teachers, our priests and popes, as we trust those people who are teaching us, so they're not only teaching us how to read and write, but they're also in that same moment teaching us right from wrong. They're subtly teaching us good and evil without you realizing it. And in your young, fresh mind, you start to believe everything that you're told. Children will make a game out of anything. I mean, I don't know if any of you have contact with young children today, but the fascinating thing about young children is that everything is normal. Everything is fun, and they believe everything you tell them. So this is me, who's a young boy, born into apartheid South Africa during the height of apartheid. Born in the late 60s, I grew up in the 70s. And for me, born into working class, white trash, Afrikaans home, apartheid was my normal. Apartheid was my common sense. Apartheid was my morality, that I was taught good from evil. And I trusted my teachers, I trusted my parents, I trusted my priests, I trusted the police, I trusted everybody who was telling me apartheid was right. So my story begins on the 6th of April 1652, when this man over here, Jan van Riebeeck, arrives in South Africa, he arrives in Cape Town, and he sets up a Dutch colony. And he says to all the indigenous people, the Hottentots, the Khoisan, he says to the indigenous people, you are now Dutch citizens. This is now part of Holland. We're imposing our flag. You see the orange, white, and blue flag. We're imposing our flag, and we're setting up a colony here. And then, as time goes by, Jan van Riebeeck becomes the father of the nation, the father of the motherland, with his face on the money. So during the English era, it was the £1 with Jan van Riebeeck, and then eventually the rand, so the pound becomes the rand, and he remains the father figure of our money and our country. Today it's Mandela who's on the money. So the Dutch arrived in 1652, and then in 1820, the British buy the country from the Dutch for £1 million. But the Dutch who had been living there had become Afrikaans. They became Boers, and they said to the English, wait a minute, you can't buy our country. It's interesting because they never thought they could come and colonize the country of the Khoisan and Hottentot, but they had big problems in somebody else doing the same to them. So they decided to go into the interior of South Africa. decided to leave the coast area and set up new republics inside. And then eventually in 1884 gold is discovered, and then in 1867 diamonds are discovered. So on the 16th of December 1838 something interesting happens, and I have an ancestor who was there. My name is on the list. My family name is on the list. So what happened was the Boers had reached a point as they were going to the interior of the country where they met the indigenous people. And they were camped on the river, on the side of a river, where they set up the ox wagons in a lago, which is a round formation to protect themselves. And there was 10,000 Zulus who were charging towards them. And these Zulus were on the warpath, and the Boers prayed to God. They said, please, this prayer, this image of the handcuff. They prayed to God and said, dear God, please protect us from these heathen, pagan, savage Zulus. And what happened was the Zulus were trying to cross the river, and it was a very fast-flowing river with a very strong current. And as the Zulus were trying to cross the river, the Boers were shooting them with their guns and their tanks. And so many Zulus died that day, it became known as the Battle of Blood River. The rivers turned red. And what happened on that day was a few hundred Boers defeated 10,000 Zulus. They concluded that this happened not because of their superior military technology, because they had guns, and because the river was a fast-flowing river. They concluded that God was on their side. And on that day, they decided that they were the chosen race. They decided that God had chosen them above all other races, including the Zulus, including the English. And this then becomes the cornerstone, the foundation for what becomes apartheid eventually. Because if God has chosen you above black people, therefore God will support you when you create the system called apartheid years later. So this eventually is built, it's called the Voortrekker Monument. And on the 16th of December every year, it was designed in the architecture, there's a thin beam of light that comes down, and there's this marble stone in the center of the Voortrekker Monument that says, we are for you, South Africa, the fatherland, the motherland. And it commemorates, and this is every year the apartheid government and all the leftover racists will gather around the Voortrekker Monument in order to celebrate the fact that God chose the Afrikaans people above all else. I'm going to take a slight detour here and talk about something that happened at the same time as the Battle of Blood River. So the British tabloids at the time, the London Illustrated News, which was the equivalent of Time magazine, I guess, in that day, had heard very much about the Zulu warrior, great mythological army led by King Shaka. And they wanted to have an image of the Zulu people. So they sent, at those days they didn't have cameras, so they had to send an artist down to South Africa to draw the Zulu, to draw those mythological warriors. I mean, the kingdom of Shaka was bigger than the kingdom of Napoleon. It stretched all the way up towards Malawi. It was thousands of kilometers big, commanded by the Zulu warriors. But something strange happened, which was the artist arrived. Now remember, it was Victorian England, it was Victorian times. The artist arrived to draw the Zulu warrior and discovered that the Zulu warrior went charging off to battle with the assegai, the spear, and the shield, and nothing else. Now, that would be a formidable army by anybody's measure. Nothing else. They were stark naked. They went to war wearing nothing but a shield and a spear. Now, in Victorian England, that was not going to be an image that white Victorian people would want to see. They would be terrified of the naked black man. So the artist imagined what Zulu people might look like. The artist took a leap of fantasy, and the artist dressed the Zulu warrior up in order to illustrate Victorian values, what the Victorians would like to see. So the leopard skin was added, the shells were, all kinds of things were added in colonial fantasy. Now what's interesting is that art historians know that today, academics know that today, historians are aware of that twist of reporting, of journalism, that what Trump might call alternative truth. However, the general people might not be aware of that. So Zulu people today, now this is the Inkatha Freedom Party, these are Zulu people today dressing up in what they think is traditional Zulu costume, which is based on the images in the London Illustrated News. So their authentic culture is entirely inauthentic. Their authentic culture is entirely based on their reading of images that they see reproduced, which were colonial fantasy. All right. So remember I said gold and diamonds were discovered. So what happened was as the Boers set up their republics, the Transvaal Republic and the Free State Republic, the British said, wait a minute, that's our country too. We didn't just buy the coastland, we also bought the interior because we want the gold and the diamonds. And in 1899 you have the second Boer War. The first one, the British lost miserably. And they lost it because they went to South Africa with the old European Napoleonic military strategy, which was just to march in straight lines with their guns, and they're wearing bright red uniforms with a white leather belt over each shoulder, which made a cross over their hearts. And the Boers were hiding behind the stones wearing khaki, and they were just shooting them, and they were just, the English were being massacred. So the English retreated, they were defeated at that. And then they came back 2 years later because they wanted the gold and the diamonds. And 2 years later, they were wearing khaki, they dug trenches. It's the first modern war. It's the blueprint for what would become the First World War. They also used, for the first time ever in the history of military technology, used barbed wire. They used barbed wire as a military weapon. They set up concentration camps. And what they did, Lord Kitchener, who did the same thing in India, he started on one side of South Africa, and he burnt. These are photographs I took. These are obviously not from the time of the Boer War, but this is a work of art called Scorched Earth with the same title. And what Kitchener did is he burnt the country from one side to the other. He burnt every crop, every field, every farm, everything, and gathered up all the women and children and put them into concentration camps. Concentration camps were invented by the British in South Africa during the Boer War. And here's another interesting detour of history. So just as the Second World War was getting going, the Nazis were curious to see whether South Africa would support the Germans or whether South Africa would support the Allies, because it could have gone in both directions, and South Africa wasn't sure which way it would, which military it was going to support. And so the Germans made a propaganda film, and here you see the image of the British soldier from the first Anglo-Boer War, not the second, with the cross over the chest and the red uniform. And it was a film made about the concentration camps. So the Nazis made a film about how the British invented concentration camps in South Africa as a way to try to get South African people to support the Nazis. So it's a strange, ironic twist over there. South Africa, in the end, did support the British, the Allies. So in 1948, South Africa becomes a republic and is independent from England, from Great Britain. And in 1948, the same year as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is declared, apartheid becomes constitutional by a man called Hendrik Verwoerd, who was Dutch. Now, this is the apartheid flag. Now, bear in mind, the apartheid flag is the Dutch flag, the British flag, and the two republics where the gold and diamonds were. So, if we are going to speak about where does apartheid come from, we have to go back to its origins. It wasn't invented in South Africa. It's not even a South African idea. The roots of apartheid, the roots of racism, the roots of the crime against humanity that I was born into are in London and in Amsterdam. But this was the country I was born into, country torn apart, racially divided, a crime against humanity. And in 1976, Soweto was burning. Soweto was burning because you had very young children who were pretty much the same age as me. I'll come to that in a minute. And they were protesting to hell with Afrikaans. They were protesting against the fact that they were being forced to study in Afrikaans. And they said, we want to study in English at least, if not in Zulu or Xhosa or Tswana or Venda or one of the other languages. Today, South Africa has 11 official languages. English and Afrikaans are 2 of the 11. There are 9 other official languages. So you imagine how many languages are spoken in South Africa. But the apartheid government insisted that they study Afrikaans. All right. Now, let me explain to you how does one become what one becomes. So on the one side, it is a very militarized country. So I was born into this working class family with a very macho, male, patriarchal idea of what one should become. what a man is supposed to be. And here's a very good example of how I was supposed to become. So one day I was at school and I was being bullied. I tended to be bullied a lot at school. And normally there was nothing I could do except fall down in a ball and cry. But on one particular occasion, I snapped. Something inside me snapped. And I had decided to fight back. And somehow there was a very sharp, under the blackboard, there was a very sharp piece of metal, which was where you would put the chalk on. And somehow I just, in my rage, thought that I should take the bully's head and smash it against this piece of metal, which I did, in order to try and defend myself. And there was blood gushing everywhere. And the school teacher arrived, and he walked in. And because the other kid was full of blood, therefore I was the guilty. And no matter how hard I tried to protest that I was actually defending myself, he wouldn't hear of it. I was the bully. And he marched me off to his office. And in his office, he made me pull down my pants and put my head underneath his desk. So my head was under the desk. And then he caned me. So every time he caned me, my head would jump up and I would bang the back of my head against the table. And he caned me a number of times. I don't remember how many lashes exactly. But I do remember some time after that, I was with my father and I was swimming. And I was wearing a swimming costume. And my father saw these blue lines running down the back of my legs. And he wanted to know, where did they come from? And I explained the story. And my father, being the patriarch he was, of course, thought that what had happened against me, my punishment, he thought was a good thing. He thought it was helping me become a man. And he had, unbeknown to me, written a letter to my teacher. Now, my teacher then, a little bit after that, gave me this envelope to give to my father. So I was walking home from school and I was very curious. Curiosity has always been something that has taken possession of my better senses. And I opened this letter. And this is what I read. Dear Mr. Geers, I refer to your letter dated the 30th of September 1978 and wish to express my sincere thanks for your attitude. As you well know, we as teachers seldom have the sort of backing we require from parents. And it was so pleasant to receive a letter from one who still believes that a good cane on the bottom serves the purpose of 1,000 or more lines. I thank you once again for your sensible attitude and assure you of my best attention. And then it's cut off there. As far as Kendell is concerned, yours, and here's the teacher. So the teacher he was my teacher, he was the vice principal, and he was a police reservist. This is known to all of us. So here we have my father, my teacher, and the police. Three forms of authority above me who are colluding in this corporal punishment, telling me that being beaten and caned to the point that I have welts, blue lines running down my legs, is how one becomes a man, how one becomes a good citizen, what he would call his best attention. This was their way of loving me. This was their way of trying to take care of me. This was their way of trying to help me become a better person. Now, something inside me that day snapped. I mean, a lot of people ask me, how did you end up in the anti-apartheid movement? How did you end up figuring out that apartheid is a crime against humanity? Because it wasn't obvious. And I guess this letter, there was something about this which my trust was broken. My faith in my father was already broken. My faith in my school teacher was broken on this day. My faith in the police was broken on that day. I never gave the letter to my father. I decided to break the chain of command, break the hierarchy, break the chain of authority, and I kept it for many years after. And then eventually, when I became an artist, years later, I transformed this object into a work of art. Now the thing is, so there you see Hector Peterson on the 16th of June 1976, who was a kid probably the same age as me. And this might be the second work of art, or maybe the first work of art I ever made, I don't know. So there's the letter from my childhood, and there's this photograph. Now the interesting thing about a working class family in South Africa is that, especially in the 70s, we didn't have cameras. Nobody took photographs. So I don't have any documents of my childhood. This is one of the very few photographs of me as a little boy, because it was, we were at some circus fairground, and there was holding this crocodile and taking photographs. You get the Polaroid, which I treasured ever since. But there's an uncanny relationship between me holding the crocodile and the image of Hector Peterson. And I was there for my birthday, which is in June. So it was more or less at the same time. And this image in South Africa, we did not see, because it was a state-run news agency. It was a state-run, at that time television didn't exist. In fact, South Africa introduced television in 1976 as a way of distracting the public from what was going on in Soweto. There's something uncanny going on there, which is maybe I'll speak about that later, which is what makes me believe in the power of art. But how does one become a good racist? So apart from the corporal punishment of being beaten into submission, there's also your idea of trust. That fresh mind of a child who reads Noddy, and Noddy's making a big mistake because you see this caricature of a black person there. Well, those were called gollywogs. And actually Enid Blyton, who is the biggest author in the world for children's books, was presenting a fundamentally racist image of black people. That we, as young minds, every kid growing up reading Noddy, with your impressionable seedbed of a mind, these seeds were growing up to become good fascist trees. Tintin in the Congo. So when Urge wrote Tintin in the Congo, he actually never went to the Congo. He went to the Africa Museum in Brussels, and he developed very racist caricature images of black people. And this is a very famous image from Tintin in the Congo, which has since been changed. So there you see Tintin in the middle of Africa, and he says, "My dear friends, today I'm going to speak to you about your country, Belgium." And there you see the map of France and Belgium, but they're in the middle of Africa. Now, they have subsequently changed that image to make it more politically correct, because more sensitive to Africa, to the context, that you are in the middle of Africa. How can you be in your country, Belgium? There's another work I made, which is a tire, and in 1985, 86, 87, when I was in art school and very violently protesting against apartheid, people were using necklaces. Winnie Mandela said, "With our matches and with our tires, we will liberate this country." And what Winnie Mandela was speaking about was they would put petrol, gasoline, into a tire, then put it over somebody and then set it alight. And once the rubber started burning, there was no way to put the fire out. It's called a necklace. So it was a form of elimination of their political opposition, which was supported by Winnie Mandela. And the sign of white trash is always the white wall tires. So I took these tractor tires and I stenciled the words, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a nigger by his toe, if he hollers, let him go." A fundamental racist poem. That as a child I said. Every kid of my generation said it. Even in America, people say this poem. What does it mean? It's fundamentally racist. But we said it as if it was normal because we were taught this fundamentally racist poem. When you're playing in the playground, you're just given this fresh information. This is what you do. So you do it because it's normal and it's common sense. Where does it come from? The same child who was reading Noddy and Tintin was also reading the Jungle Book and the Just So stories of Rudyard Kipling, who also happened to write Land and Sea Tales for Scouts and Guides because he was a very good friend of Baden-Powell, who started the Boy Scouts movement. And Baden-Powell started the Boy Scouts movement in South Africa during the Boer War as the reserve army for the British military. And in this book, so the screen's not working exactly correctly because of the scaling, but so in the book it says, "What is the song that children sing when doorway lilacs bloom in spring, blah, 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 blah." In the guidebook for Boy Scouts, Rudyard Kipling is saying, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a nigger by his toe, if he hollers, let him go." So here we have the Boy Scout movement teaching you this fundamentally racist poem, which then spreads like a virus across every children's playground. And the front book, on the very first page, he has the swastika with his signature. That's the frontispiece of the book. I mean, he might be forgiven because when he wrote that book, Hitler had not yet risen to power, and he was probably still trying to refer to the Hindu symbol for the rising and setting sun, as did Carlsberg Beer, who still has the swastika at the entrances to their breweries. So this brings me into the end of my childhood, where when I was 15, I had figured out that apartheid was a crime against humanity. I had lost faith in my father, I had lost faith in my family, and decided to run away from home and change my name. And at that time, the backbone of apartheid was the military. So what would happen is twice a year, once in June and once in December, every single white man from the age of 15 on would get a conscription paper. And the conscription paper, or the call-up paper, was to go to the army. You'd go to the army for 2 years, and then every year thereafter, 3 months, to keep militarized. If you decided not to go to the army, you'd go to jail for 6 years. And the only other option, well, there was no other option. Either go to jail or you go to the army. And the only other option was to study. Now, if you're at school at 15, that's no problem. You get a letter from the school secretary to say you're still at school, and then you defer your call-up paper for 6 months. But eventually, at some point, I was finishing school. So I had to either go to the army, or go to jail, or study. So for me, the only option was to study. So I went to the local university and decided that I was going to study mathematics and science. My idea was to move into the field of quantum physics. I was very, South Africa had a very big nuclear engineering program. They had developed atomic bombs. They were in the process of developing nuclear power stations. And I was very interested in the idea of quantum physics. So I took the form for the university, and it stipulated that you had to give two choices. A first choice and a second choice. If you didn't fill in the second choice, the first choice would be disqualified and your application would be null and void. And I was so angered by the fact that at this time I was a very young, very angry young man, very militant in the anti-apartheid logic, raging a war against every form of authority, starting with the police and the army and the government and the church. And in my rage, the fact that they were forcing me to put a second choice, when it was so clear to me that my destiny in life was to go into quantum physics, that I was enraged, and I went through the list of everything that you could possibly study at university in search of something ridiculous. I wanted to make a mockery of their authority. I wanted to make a joke of the fact that they were taking away my freedom. And there was this thing called art, fine arts, Bachelor of Arts, BAFA. And I said, that's it. I'm going to put that as a second choice because that's ridiculous. That is just pathetic, it's ridiculous, can't take it seriously, and it's a way of me being a clown and poking fun at their authority. Something strange happened. I was accepted to both courses. And then right at the end of the year, the schooling year, I received the letter to say I'd been accepted to both. And for the very first time in my life, I asked this question, what is art? I had no clue. I did not know the difference between Da Vinci and Picasso. I'd never been to an art museum. I'd never opened an art book. I'd never looked at a work of art, ever, my entire life. I did write poetry, but now I realize it was connected, but at that time I didn't see a connection. And I went to the art class to see what they were doing, just out of curiosity. And it was right at the end of the year. And the teacher had decided to exit the curriculum. Because it was the end of the year, she could actually speak about something she was impassioned about. She would speak about something that was off the grid and something that excited her. So normally Dada would not be taught in a South African school. But she was speaking about Dada, and she wasn't quite right, but it was right for me, and the perfect words I needed to hear on that day, by chance and by coincidence. She said that there were these artists who, during the First World War, had decided that they would retreat to the neutral country of Switzerland. And they had said that if mustard gas, trench warfare, barbed wire, and all the atrocities of the First World War were the result and the product of the rational, logical brain, they would do the irrational, illogical opposite. And something inside me went ping. Something inside me clicked. And I understood that, wait a minute, I'm going to study. Now, so there were two reasons why I wanted to study quantum physics. One, I was fascinated by mathematics. The more abstract, the more fascinating. But two, I wanted to study something my family could not imagine. Because when I decided to run away, I wanted to put as much distance between me and my family as possible. I wanted to become something that for them was inconceivable. And suddenly I thought, I'm going to study only to not go to the army and to not go to jail. Because if it wasn't for that, who knows what I would have done with my life. And I'm going to study because I want to create this abstract distance to my family. And I thought, well, if art can be this irrational, illogical contrary of the rational authoritarianism of the world that I'd been born into, of the machismo, of the patriarchy that I'd been born into, let me go and study art. And if I could not imagine what art was, imagine what my family could not imagine. So, and the problem was, if you'd gone into the army, what you would be doing was you'd be going into Soweto and shooting black protesters. Or if you weren't in Soweto, you'd be in Angola because South Africa was fighting a war. So basically, during the Cold War, the United States was supporting the South African military to fight a war in Angola, which was against the Russians and the Cubans. So you had the civil war going on in Angola, which pretended to be about capitalism versus communism, but it was deeply inside the Cold War, engineered by the Soviets and by the Americans. And yeah, at university I became a very outspoken anti-apartheid activist. Here you see me in 1985, May 1985, still with the hair, and we're being arrested in one of the most violent days in campus history. And you see it's a very bright, sunshiny summer day because all the police are wearing short sleeves and it's very hot. But we are all wearing sweaters because we knew that we were going to jail for a while that night. We were protesting and we were going out there using our bodies to make clear our anti-apartheid convictions. And eventually in 1988, in my final year at university, as part of a group of white men, I'm somewhere in that photograph, in which we said, no, we will never go to the army. It was a very powerful statement for the anti-apartheid movement because the idea in South Africa at the time, now I remember having girlfriends who would say to me, when I would say to them, I'm not going to the army, they would say, well then how do you become a man? It was in our culture that you have to go to the army. It was a rite of passage, and if you didn't go to the army, you never become a real man. And so to have a group of white men say that we would rather go to jail or into exile or into hiding or underground, but we will not go to the army, no matter what you do. You cannot torture us. You cannot force us. So it's a very powerful statement. And, well, I mean, some of the people in our group were arrested. Here you see my name. Some of the people in the group were arrested and got 6-year prison sentences, but they were sent to civilian jails, not military jails, where they were raped and beaten and destroyed. I mean, they still haven't recovered. So violent was the way they were being treated in prison. So I decided, well, I'm going to go into exile. So I went off to London as a refugee. So all those refugees you see banging at your borders, well, I was one of those once upon a time. Refugees come in every color, shape, and size. I was being persecuted in my country, which was at war, and my only option to survive was to go into exile. And from London, I went to New York, and it was very brief. It was only for 1 year, 1989. And then, when Mandela was released in 1990, I could go back home to South Africa. Now, the first thing I did when I got home was I took the blood out of my arm and I washed myself in my own blood to make this image. Because what I was trying to do in this moment was give birth to myself. Because the war is over. We won the revolution. History had changed sides. Mandela was now the leader of democracy. Released 4 years later, he'd be elected. But there's something strange that happens. So here I am, a young white man whose ancestors had been at the Battle of Blood River, on the Afrikaans side, who had run away from home, trying to wash myself with my own blood. But at the same time, I will never be clean. Because you suddenly realize, now think about this, you all come from a family, you all come from a culture, you all come from a language, you all come from a tradition. Whether it's Christmas or whether it's Carnival or whatever your traditions may be, you have certain things that bind you to your time and place, that bind you to your communities, that bind you to your heritage and bind you to your morality. You believe certain things because your family believes them, or your greater family. And even if you have disagreements with your family, you're bound by heritage, culture, tradition. Now, what happens if every single thing that you are, your morality, your heritage, your culture, your tradition, your ancestry, every single thing is a lie? What happens if everything about you is a crime against humanity? You have to start again. And I had to give birth to myself in order to become an artist, in order to reinvent a language, in order to reinvent a way of seeing, in order to create a new way of speaking, a new way of believing. Literally give birth to myself from the bottom to the top. There was nothing that I could take with me from my heritage or my culture. Now, remember the banana experiment? Well, I was playing with you. It didn't happen. The whole thing was a lie. The whole thing was a lie, and I'll tell you why the whole thing was a lie. Because, so, the first time I heard that story was actually in Oslo. I was deeply impressed. I was so excited about that story about the monkeys because it made sense of everything I wanted to think. It made sense of everything I wanted to believe. It made sense of how we get constructed, of how we inherit moralities, how we inherit ideas. So I believed it completely. And the story was so fascinating that when I was going to give a lecture, I wanted to talk about it. But I wanted to know who was the person who did that experiment and when did they do it. In my mind, it's like, well, it's a great experiment, but who? How many monkeys were in the cage? Did they really use a fire hydrant? How did it really work? So I go on the internet and I find dozens of those images I showed you. Dozens of examples from self-help groups, from corporate management groups, from all kinds of make the world a better place, become a better social engineer, become a better businessman kind of groups. That's especially businessmen like those PowerPoints about the monkeys. But actually it never happened. It's urban legend. And the reason why I tell you that story, for me, the reason why the story about the monkeys is so important to tell is because you all believed it. Because you wanted to believe it. Because it was so nice and neat. But we're not that nice and neat. We're not that simple. We're not that one-dimensional. We're not that easy to con. Well, we are complex, multidimensional, multisensory beings that function usually best in contradiction. Because we get taken over by all sorts of things, from language to emotion. I mean, let's talk about language. So who are we, where do we come from, and where are we going? So this is a beautiful painting of Gauguin, and I especially love this image here, which one might presume is probably an Adam or an Eve figure plucking the apple from the tree of life. But in fact, I think it's that what Gauguin was actually quoting here is Botticelli, which is this painting here. And over here, this figure here, who's pointing his wand at the apples in the tree, is no other than Hermes. And Hermes is the trickster god. Hermes is the god, the Greek god who gives us language. He's the trickster who is the patron saint of artists, thieves, and gives us language. The equivalent in Egypt is Thoth, who is the god who, when you die, so Thoth gives us language, and he wrote the Emerald Tablet, which is the alchemist's secret book, which is as above, so which has the conclusion as above, so below. And so Thoth, when you die, will weigh your heart against a feather to see whether or not you've been a good person. But the trickster god who gives us language is universal. It's in every culture. In indigenous Native American culture, it's the coyote who brings language. And there's always this relationship between the language and the trickster. Where does language come from? What is language about? So I was always fascinated. So as I was trying to give birth to myself, as I was trying to become the artist, as I was in search of my own identity, morality, and language, I was interested in where does language come from? How do we inherit language? So the Bible and the Epic of Gilgamesh and every sacred book, ancient book. Now the Bible is fascinating because the first 4 chapters of the Bible, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like the Vedas and the Egyptian Book of the Dead, were the first books ever written. It's fascinating. Our ancestors didn't start out with writing the cat sat on the mat. No, they just came straight up with the Bhagavad Gita. They just came straight up with the Vedas, with the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mean, I don't know where they practiced, but it just pops out. These like books which have never been improved upon. Fascinating. But in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Bible, they talk about the Tower of Babel. And Babel translates as a gateway, as a portal, as an opening to another dimension. And our ancestors were building the Tower of Babel, and God, according to the Old Testament, or the gods, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, according to the polytheistic version, the gods or God become threatened by the building of the Tower of Babel and decide to intervene and stop our ancestors from building this tower by introducing the confusion of tongues. So from one day to another, our ancestors wake up and they're all speaking different languages, and therefore they can't complete the tower. Now this is fascinating because I'm 100% certain that it wasn't about Swedish and English, because I'm sure they could have figured out a way to solve that problem. I think it was something else more profound. For instance, it is said that before the Tower of Babel, we were speaking the Adamic language, the language from the Garden of Eden, which is called the language of the birds. And I think what the gods actually give us is language itself. The fact that we suddenly started to speak, because the day you learn to speak is the day you learn to lie. So what is this Tower of Babel that gives us the capacity to become divine? What is it that is within our reach? If we can find a way to get past the language problem, that we can actually reach up into the domain that might threaten God or the gods, in which we embody our own divinity. I don't know, but it's part of my quest as an artist to understand that process. But I take two conclusions from the story, and that is that language is divine, but it's a curse. Language is a divine curse, which might be the reason why in the word believe. So here's an image set up in Rome at the Villa Medici, and if you look in this direction, you see there the monument to the unknown soldier, and in the other direction, a different camera angle looking across the Vatican. So we have the word believe, but the three middle letters at the heart of the word believe is the word lie. So when I asked you earlier, what do you believe in? How will you know that what you believe in is what you believe in? How will you know that what you believe in is not a lie, that you inherited like a monkey from your ancestors? The word terror becomes error. The word border becomes order. The word danger becomes anger. If you write the word revolution backwards, you get the word love. Slaughter becomes laughter. Here's the words play and pray embedded within the same words. Now, English fascinates me because English is really the marriage between French and German, old ancient French and ancient German. Because when the Norman kings set up home in England and English was being formed, what happened was the aristocracy was speaking French and the peasants were speaking German, Old French and Old German, which is why in English you can choose two words, an English or a German, you can choose a French or a German word for absolutely everything. But typically, on the table, on the farm, it's called chicken from the German, kicken, and poultry on the table. Calf on the table, veal on the calf on the field, veal on the table. Swine in the field, pork on the table. So, because the aristocracy was French speaking, we have French words for things we eat. Because the peasants were Germanic speaking, we have Germanic words for animals. But that plays out on every level of the English language, because it's a class consciousness. So if you want to speak proper English, elevated English, high class English, aristocratic English, you will tend to use the French words. If you want to be vulgar and working class and trash, you'll use the German words, without even realizing it. So for instance, fuck is coming from the German ficken, and copulate is coming from copulitis, the Latin. These are two English words to describe the same thing. So you'll fuck on the field and copulate on the table. King is coming from König, royal is coming from royal. Now the interesting thing is that the word king, kingdom, country, county, cunt and cave are all the same. They're all coming from, and you go and see at the bottom here, is Kunus Diabolos. So in the pagan heathen ancestry, the cave represented the cunt, the vagina of Mother Nature. This was when our ancestors still respected the earth, still respected the land that gives us sustenance, that gives us energy, that nourishes us, without which we would die. This cave was a sacred, holy place where you would go inside to make your paintings, where you'd go inside for initiation. The cave was not a bad place. And so the idea of the cave, the cunt, eventually becomes the county, the country, the king and the kingdom, all from the same etymological. And it's very often the Virgin Mary tends to appear around caves and waterfalls, strangely. So one last thing, and then I'll stop and take questions. So William Burroughs said language is a virus. Here we have a painting by a man called Gerard Sekoto, who was a black South African. He made this painting in 1948. It's called Song of the Pig, before he went into exile and lived in Paris, where he eventually died in poverty and unknown to South Africans. And here, my homage to Gerard Sekoto, so this is called Song of the Pig, which is a series of body bags in a passage which creates a crossroad, which is where Hermes was the patron saint of thieves, and people would erect a herm at the crossroads in order to protect themselves from thieves, which is also why. So Hermes was born on the 25th of December from a virgin mother, dies and comes back to life again, just like Jesus. So the crossroads has a very ancient pagan tradition which Christianity would later pick up upon and be a parasitic, have a parasitic relationship with. So the thing about George Sokoto's Song of the Pick, so this became a very important anti-apartheid painting, a very important, profound symbol of the anti-apartheid movement, because what you have here is you have the white foreman with his hands in his pocket, smoking a pipe, doing absolutely nothing. And you have the chain gang with the black people in their colourful clothes working with their pickaxes, digging up the road. And it was said, even in my childhood, which was in the 70s, so that's 30 years after the Sokoto painting, I was told that black people like to sing when they work, because when they're singing, they're more happy, and therefore they work better. This is how white people understood the Song of the Pick. But the Song of the Pick is more ambiguous than that, because, yes, indeed, the black people are more happy when they're singing. But they're not more happy because they're singing. They're more happy because of what they're singing. So they were singing in Zulu or in Xhosa, and the white man only understood English or Afrikaans. And they were singing protest songs. They were saying, when we finish building this road, we're going to kill this fascist. We're going to destroy his home, and we're going to take back our country. But because he didn't understand their language, he thought they were happy because they were singing rather than they were protesting. So the limits of your language are the limits of your world. What you can't say doesn't exist. So I'll stop there and take questions if you have any. It's a lot of information, and I definitely can go on, but I see your heads have a saying fool. A lot of history. No questions? Yes.
Maybe it's a personal question,
yes.
But did you ever get in contact with your family again after?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a big family. So my mother left when I was 5 years old because my father was an alcoholic rapist, and because my mother was a stripper, my father got 100% custody. So I never saw my mother growing up, because in the eyes of the patriarchal apartheid judges, a mother who was a stripper was an illegitimate, unqualified mother. But the father, they didn't care, so we got 100%, he got 100% custody. So when I was 15, I went in search of finding my mother. And from my mother and father, there's another brother and a sister. And then between my father and mother, I have 9 siblings. And some of the siblings I have contact with, some of them I don't have contact with. And interestingly, recently, so in December, I was back in South Africa with my children. And I'd always said so my son is 10, and my daughter is 12. And I'd always been very clear to them about the history of my family, and the reasons for running away, and the reasons for not speaking to my father. And I explained to them that I would not stand in their way of ever meeting their father, my father, their grandfather. And so when we're going back to South Africa, my son said, okay, so we're going back, I want to meet my grandfather. And I said, okay, I cannot deny you that, because you need to have your own relationship with your grandfather. And I was there for a brother's wedding, and there was a big discussion between my siblings about who would or would not be going with my son and daughter to meet their grandfather. And in the end, I decided I would go, together with one of my sisters. And I went to see my father again, the first time since I was 15. But I went not seeking an apology. I went not asking, not looking for an explanation or justification. And, it took a lot of courage to run away, but it took a lot more courage to go back. And I went to my father with an open heart of forgiveness. So I know that he will never understand my pain. I know that he will never understand the reasons why I left or why I ran away. But I don't need to, because in order for me to heal, I need to let him go. So yes, so I went back, I saw my father. It was very brief it was basically, we saw each other for an hour and a half. I don't think I would see him again, but it was a very important process for me to go with my children, to be able to let go of something. Understanding need not be there. Forgiveness need not be there. Discussion need not be there. It's just surrendering to a higher force.
How do you feel about South Africa today?
Oh, that's a terrible question. Well, I choose not to live in South Africa. I choose not to live there. When I went back in 1990, I was that period from 1990 to 94, actually from 1990 to 97, but especially until 94. So the end of apartheid, before the first election, I am incredibly grateful to have lived through that process, because it was a moment in time where you felt anything was possible and everybody had a voice. What I did at that time to earn a living was I was writing for the newspapers, and I had a voice. I mean, I was writing for the daily newspaper, I was writing for the left-wing weekly Afrikaans newspaper, and people were reading what I was saying. There was dialogue and discussion about what this new democracy might be. And it was incredibly exhilarating and empowering, exciting. It was really a honeymoon period. But then, basically after Mandela, things started to shift and twist and change in a very terrible kind of way, where corruption took root. Corruption, violence, rape and murder. The most recent statistics of the most violent cities in the world, Cape Town is at number 16 or something, most violent city in the world. And Johannesburg is at number 50 or something like that. 10 years ago, Johannesburg was number 1, uncontested, most violent city in the world. Now, if you live in South Africa, Cape Town is where you go for holidays, and it is considered in South Africa crime-free. So if Cape Town is number 16, how can Johannesburg be number 50 unless they're cooking the books? So even on the statistical level, there's corruption in order to try to encourage tourism. Johannesburg is unofficially the most violent city in the world. And I always explain it by saying, I don't know how many people you know personally, not somebody you've heard of or a friend of a friend, but somebody you know personally who's been raped or murdered. Most people might know none, some people might know one, but it's very rare in Europe. In South Africa, I can't make a list, it's so long. How many people I know? Friends, people who went to art school with me, neighbors, raped, murdered. I did not enter the anti-apartheid movement with all my naivety and utopian ideas in order for the country to be taken apart by corruption. When you travel in Johannesburg, when you travel through South Africa today and the police stop you and they give you a clipboard with, basically you were traveling at this speed, so here's your fine that you'd have to pay, and here's the bribe. It's actually, they present it to you, like you choose, pay the fine and give me the cash right now. Corruption is at that level. It's from the president, from Zuma all the way down. It's difficult for me to digest that information. I go back to South Africa a lot. Personally, I'm very invested in the country, very involved in the country, very supportive of the country. I do believe that South Africa might one day become a country I'd like to live in. But for the time being, you go from walls to malls. Everybody's living behind these electric fences that are 12 foot high, and you get in your car and you drive as quickly as you can to the shopping mall in the hope of not getting hijacked. And when I say hijacked, it's with an AK-47 at the window, and if you don't get out the car fast enough, they just shoot you. That's not a life I want to live, and that's not the democracy that we all fought for. So it's difficult for me to digest that. So I prefer for the time being to live in Belgium, because otherwise I become, it's in my nature to be angry and an angry man. And it's something that in terms of my own healing, I fight against. And if I live in South Africa, I become enraged. So in terms of making the world a better place, I think I can do it better by healing myself in Belgium.
So do you think your experience of alienation worked in your favor as an artist and
yes.
in your process of
There's no doubt about that. That losing faith in. So for instance, the Battle of Blood River on the 16th of December was always a public holiday in South Africa. And it was called the Day of the Covenant. So the covenant with God. So this was the cornerstone of apartheid, where God chose my nation, my tribe, the Afrikaans people. it is still a holiday today, but because history changed sides, so the thing is that what you understand, if you live through what I lived through, is that history is written by the winner. And if the winner changes, history changes. So you discover history is not written in stone. So today, it's still a public holiday, but it's not the public holiday celebrating the Boers winning. Now it's called the Day of Atonement, the Day of Forgiveness. Now it's celebrating the Zulus being murdered. It's the same event. But because history changed, now we've changed the reading of that event. So when you lose faith in the higher authorities of family, church, state, even history, language, suddenly everything becomes malleable and open. And suddenly you start to look at things in very different ways. And I wonder how many of you now will go home today thinking about the things I've said, and imagine if your life hit the brick wall like mine did, how much of everything that you've been taught to believe in is a lie, built on fear or desire. How much of what you take for granted might actually be somebody else's trickery? Not necessarily. And the thing is, when I went back to see my father to basically tell him that I forgive him, I wasn't doing it to make him happy. I was doing it because I understood that he was as much a victim as I was. That he was born into his time and place, and his alcoholic, abusive father had made him into what he became. And we're all somehow tied into these things, and some of us are fortunate enough to be able to go through that process where the alienation actually opens up a door where you're able to step outside of your circumstance and look down and have this out-of-body experience where you actually see yourself and go, okay, maybe I can fix that, maybe I can change that. But most people don't have that luck of being able to step out. Most people are locked into what they would call normal. Why do you do it like that? Well, because it's normal. Everybody does it like that. In the cannibal tribe, well, it's normal. We all eat heads and toes because everybody does it. That's normal. How would you know it's not normal if you don't have an opportunity to have a different experience? So yes, and I guess, if I carry on talking now, the thing is that the rest of, so this was there was a very important turning point in my life where I started to understand that my going to that Dada lecture was not coincidental at all. It was a calling. That there are more things functioning in the world. This is why we can't fit into the monkey boxes, because we're not that simple. We are more than 5 senses. We are more than 3 dimensions. We are multidimensional beings where we know things that we don't know, where we see things that are not there. Every time you think about a person, then you get a message from them or they call you, you're going to put that off as coincidence. It's not coincidence. And there are, this is, in trying to understand my role as an artist, at some point I returned to Saul Lewitt's definition from 1969 of conceptual art. And he said, conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. They lead to conclusions that logic cannot reach. Now this for me becomes then the role of the artist.